The night in New York was icy, as if winter itself had decided to remind everyone of its power. The city, however, as always, sparkled with millions of lights reflecting off the skyscraper's glass facades. Melania Trump, wrapped in a luxurious cashmere coat, stepped out of a limousine after a charity dinner attended by the world's most influential people. She decided to take a walk, savoring the rare moments of silence she so cherished in her busy life. The park she walked through was almost empty. Only a lone figure, wrapped in a tattered blanket, sat on a bench under a street lamp. Melania slowed her pace. Her attention was drawn to the woman's face. It seemed familiar, but she couldn't immediately place it. As she approached, she looked more closely. It was an elderly woman with gray hair tied in a messy bun and deep wrinkles on her face that told stories no one had asked about. Her eyes, though tired, still radiated kindness and warmth. "Excuse me," Melania said softly, leaning toward the woman. "Are you Mrs. Carter?" The woman slowly raised her head, her gaze foggy, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. "Yes, it's me," she replied, slightly embarrassed. "But I don't recognize you." "It's me, Melania Naus. You taught me in middle school." Mrs. Carter's eyes widened in astonishment. She stared at Melania, as if trying to find the girl she once knew in her features. "Melania, my goodness, you've become so famous." Her voice trembled, and she wiped away a tear that had involuntarily rolled down her cheek. Melania smiled, but her heart ached. She remembered her as a kind, wise teacher who not only explained algebra, but also taught life lessons. Mrs. Carter always found time for every student, inspiring them to dream bigger. Now she sat here on a cold bench without a home or hope. "What happened? Why are you here?" Melania asked, sitting down beside her. Mrs. Carter sighed, her breath turning into a cloud of vapor in the cold air. "Life, it's not always fair. I lost my job when the school closed. Then my husband passed away, and I was left alone. My pension isn't enough even for food and the rent." She fell silent, clenching her fists to warm them. "Anyway, I ended up here." Melania was silent, but a plan was already forming in her mind. She couldn't just walk away. "Come with me," she said, standing up and extending her hand. "I can't leave you here." Mrs. Carter hesitated but then took her hand. Her fingers were as cold as ice, but Melania held them tightly, as if trying to share some of her warmth. The next morning they met in a cozy cafe that smelled of freshly brewed coffee and warm croissants. Mrs. Carter, now dressed in clean clothes Melania had bought her at a nearby store, looked at her former student with gratitude. "You were always an example to me," Melania said, pouring her a cup of tea. "You taught us not just math, but kindness. I can't let you live on the streets." "You don't have to help me," Mrs. Carter replied quietly, lowering her eyes. "But I want to. I have the resources, and I want to do something meaningful." Melania shared her plan with her. She didn't just want to help one woman, she wanted to change the system. A week later, Melania Trump held a press conference that attracted dozens of journalists from around the world. Standing beside her was Mrs. Carter, now confident and smiling. "This person inspired me to create a new charitable foundation," Melania announced, her voice firm and confident. "We will help former teachers who find themselves in difficult life situations. No one who gave us knowledge and inspiration should be left without support." The journalists applauded and cameras clicked, capturing the moment. Mrs. Carter, tears of joy in her eyes, looked at Melania as if seeing not just a former student, but also hope for thousands like herself. A few days later, Mrs. Carter walked into her new apartment, provided by the foundation. It wasn't just a home, it was a place where she could feel safe. On the table lay a letter. "Dear Mrs. Carter, thank you for everything you did for me and so many others. You deserve happiness and comfort. With respect, Melania." She smiled, looking out the window. Beyond the glass stretched the city that once seemed so cold and indifferent to her. Now she felt that her life was entering a new chapter. Mrs. Carter's life changed dramatically. The new apartment provided by Melania's foundation became more than just a shelter for her. It became a true home. She once again felt like a part of society, and this inspired her to achieve new things. One morning, while sitting with a cup of coffee and reading the newspaper, Mrs. Carter came across an article about the shortage of teachers in low-income schools. Her heart ached. She remembered how she used to stand at the blackboard, explaining complex topics to children, and how her eyes lit up when they began to understand. I can still be useful, she thought aloud. Meanwhile, Melania continued to actively develop her foundation. She personally met with teachers who received assistance, and each time their stories inspired her. But one day she received an unexpected letter from Mrs. Carter. Dear Melania, thank you for everything you've done for me. You gave me not just a roof over my head, but also faith in myself. I want to return to teaching. There are schools where children need teachers, and I feel I can help. Thank you for inspiring me to believe in my strength again. Sincerely, Mrs. Carter. Melania smiled as she read the letter. She realized that her foundation was doing more than just providing material assistance. It was giving people back their dreams. A few weeks later, Mrs. Carter was standing at the blackboard again, this time in a small school in Brooklyn. Her classroom was full of children who looked at her with curiosity and hope. She began the lesson with simple words. You know, kids, life can be tough sometimes, but it's important to remember that each of you is capable of great things. Even if it feels like everything is against you, never give up. Her words resonated with the students. They saw in her not just a teacher, but a person who had been through hardships and hadn't broken. When Melania learned about Mrs. Carter's return to teaching, she decided to personally visit her school. As she entered the classroom, the children applauded. Mrs. Carter, smiling, walked over to her former student. Thank you for inspiring me, she said, hugging Melania. You inspired me, Melania replied. You showed that it's never too late to start over. The story of Melania and Mrs. Carter became a symbol of hope and mutual support. Melania's foundation began not only helping teachers, but also creating programs for their retraining and employment. Schools across the country started receiving support, and children gained access to quality education. But most importantly, this story inspired thousands of people around the world. Social media was flooded with stories of ordinary people helping each other, inspired by Melania's actions. One evening, Melania and Mrs. Carter sat in the very cafe where it all began. They laughed, reminiscing about the past and made plans for the future. You know, Melania said, I always thought success was measured by money and fame, but now I understand that true success is the ability to change someone's life for the better. Mrs. Carter smiled. You've already changed more than one life, Melania, and I'm sure this is just the beginning. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. Melania Trump and her foundation had become symbols of hope and change. Mrs. Carter, having returned to teaching, inspired her students, and her story inspired thousands of people around the world. It seemed like the perfect ending. But one morning, Melania received a strange letter. It was handwritten, and the handwriting seemed familiar. Dear Melania, I must confess something important to you. Everything that happened was not a coincidence. I didn't end up in that park by chance that night. I knew you would be there. I was watching you. Sincerely, Mrs. Carter. Melania reread the letter several times, unable to believe her eyes. Her heart raced. She remembered that night, the cold park, the exhausted woman on the bench. Could it all have been planned? She immediately called Mrs. Carter. What does this mean? Melania asked, trying to stay calm. Melania, I need to explain, Mrs. Carter replied, her voice trembling. I didn't want to deceive you, but I needed your attention. Why? What for? Because I knew that only you could help not just me, but thousands of other teachers. I've seen how you help people, and I knew your foundation could change everything. But I was afraid you wouldn't pay attention to me if I simply asked for help. Melania was silent, trying to process what she had just heard. I didn't want to hurt you, Mrs. Carter continued. I just wanted to do something important. Melania felt a mix of anger, disappointment, and understanding. She remembered how Mrs. Carter had always taught her, sometimes you have to take a risk to achieve something great. You could have just asked, Melania finally said. I would have helped. I know, Mrs. Carter replied quietly, but I was afraid my request would get lost among thousands of others. Melania decided to meet her in person. They sat in the same cafe where it all began. You know this was wrong, Melania said, looking her in the eye. Yes, Mrs. Carter admitted, and I'm ready to face the consequences, Melania sighed. But you still did something important. You inspired me to create a foundation that has already helped thousands of people. And I'm glad for that, Mrs. Carter said. But I understand that I betrayed your trust. Melania thought long and hard about what to do. In the end, she decided not to make the story public. She realized that despite the deception, Mrs. Carter had acted with the best of intentions. Let's start over, Melania said, extending her hand. Mrs. Carter smiled and tears of gratitude welled up in her eyes. Thank you, Melania. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, Melania received another letter. This time it was from an anonymous sender. Dear Melania, you think you know the truth, but Mrs. Carter is not who she claims to be. She's not your teacher. Her real name is Carterson, and she's an actress who was hired to stage this inspiring story. Sincerely anonymous. Melania felt the ground slip from under her feet. She immediately launched an investigation. It turned out that Mrs. Carter was indeed an actress hired to create the appearance of an inspiring story. When Melania met her for the last time, Mrs. Carter, or Carterson, confessed, I was hired to create a story that would draw attention to your foundation. I didn't know it would go this far. Who hired you? Melania asked. I can't say, she replied, but know that I genuinely admire what you've done. Melania realized she had been used, but she also understood that, despite the deception, her foundation had truly helped thousands of people. She decided not to shut it down but became more cautious. The story of Melania and her teacher became a reminder that even the most inspiring stories can have a dark side. But it also showed that even in a world of deception and manipulation, there's still an opportunity to do good.